Disclaimer: the information and education material contained herein is meant to promote the general understanding and dialogue of GANS processing. Such information is not meant or intended to serve as a substitute for a healthcare professional's clinical training, experience, or judgment. For patients and individuals, such information is not to be a substitute for professional medical, therapeutic, or healthcare advice or counseling. For medical issues or concerns, including decisions about medications and other treatments, readers, viewers, listeners should always consult their physician or, in serious cases, seek immediate assistance from emergency personnel. Prescription information, procedures, and use of medical devices information should be undertaken only by properly trained and certified medical personnel. We specifically disclaim any warranties, express or implied, including implied warranties of merchantability or fitness for a particular purpose. Such information is provided, as is, and is believed to be accurate at the time of its publishing, but it is the viewer's job to evaluate the accuracy of any information found in this presentation. Every case presented is of their own experience, applied by themselves for themselves, and it applies to their case only. Every person experiencing health problems should seek professional medical advice and consult their course of treatment with a doctor. The processes of plasma balancing described herein are a natural process which supports the body but does not replace medical advice or therapies one is already subject to.
Okay, we see your screen. Yes.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us on this beautiful Sunday afternoon. And I must comment on it's just truly wonderful to be here with all of you, because not only is it a great time to be alive, but you are all tuning in very, very nicely and contributing in so many ways, which is just really, really wonderful. And that's what makes our meeting so strong. I mean, we are coming up behind the Knowledge Seekers Workshop on Thursday, the Brazilian Communities Opus on Friday, and at least we are able to bring together this kind of teaching and share it across 6 continents and maybe even 7. This is the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute teachings on plasma science. We're discussing the intermediate GANS tech. Today's topic is translation. My name is Alexander. I am from Canada. It is November the 2nd of 2025, and this is part of the Keshe Foundation North America Plasma Education Series. So please enjoy the trip, because we've been on a long trip. Obviously, we're discussing intermediate GANS, and has been going on for many, many years as we try to distill the information into bite-sized pieces. And what we've ended up with is a bunch of bite-sized pieces. And so as we add to the knowledge, we are conflicted, because we have to move ahead as mature knowledge seekers, but we can't leave the new knowledge seekers behind. So we always maintain that connection between that, but all of us collectively are forced to do something a little bit different these days because of we have visitors. And it's not just a matter of being nice to the visitors. It's not the kind of visitors that we have been taught to expect. And so we have to kind of, shall we say, interpret what is going on. And so which brings us to the subject of translation. And it really is exposing our confusion in terms of words. And the scientific community has its own words, but so does the spiritual community, and so does the archaeological community. And, you know, there are many, many communities, many languages all around the world, and it causes a massive amount of confusion. And what we've been trying to do through the books of Meron Tavakoli Keshe, such as book number 1, is to come up with a uniform understanding of the universal order of the creation of matter, and how it does come together with the bringing together of the matter, the dark matter, and the antimatter. And so the convergence of those three forces creates the one force, but that force is only one structure. And there are multiple structures like that. And in order to convey information between one structure and another structure, we have another structure, as in book number 2, the structure of the light. And that is how information moves from one place to another. And when we say information, that is a word that we are having difficulty understanding. We have, the internet, which is conveying information, and we like to do our shopping on the internet. Well, the shopping is of physical products, and yet we do this by exchanging information on the internet. We have still not resolved how to exchange products using that information other than by using a courier. So that brings us to book number 3, The Origin of the Universe, and how we are creating two fields from that one, which may or may not dissolve, except that we don't even recognize that field that created us. We don't even recognize the sister universe. We're having trouble with our own universe. And we're very content with just worrying about that little drop in the ocean of man's universe we call Earth. And we kind of look up to the stars and say, well, isn't that nice? But now we're looking up at the stars and we're seeing a totally different picture. So that we've been talking about the Universal Council as we understand it with Rick Crammond and the members of the Universal Council through 401 weeks, bringing together the one planet, one nation, one race for justice and world peace, and understanding the importance of it now because of the gravity of the situation, pardon the pun. The thing is that we are now on the verge of having to recognize the Universal Council of the universe and our participation in it. So we need to understand the plasma rule even more, what we call the transaction zone or a point of conflict. But is it, or is it a binding zone? And what happens in that binding zone? Well, more often than not, there's a density manifestation. So we call that an inertia density manifestation. But in that binding zone, there could be another zone that's created. So we're trying to understand what is it when we bring these two fields together, what exactly is it? So language becomes very important. Is it a transaction zone? Is it a conflict point? Or is it a binding zone? Or really, depending on the context, it's all three. In the context that we're understanding is our self-serving energy binding needs. So that becomes our dimension point that we focus on. And it is so intensive that we do it at the expense of others. And the reason we do that is because, well, it's kind of easy to do. It's a lot easier for me to cut off your connection and limit your progress than it is for me to generate and create. And we find that it is indeed very, very prosperous. A point was brought up to me this week that one of the problems with binding energy at the expense of others is that the joy that is associated with creating that energy binding is diminished. And therefore, someone who is binding energy in that manner doesn't have the respect for energy. Let's say if you were struggling to meet your monthly payments and suddenly you didn't have to depend on a strategic day-to-day existence, but basically maybe you won a lottery ticket and all of a sudden you didn't have to worry about that. And because the money came easy, the money would leave easy. Well, interestingly enough, that is the same that is happening, let's say, with someone who is, shall we say, involved with in the music industry, very famous, or someone in the drug industry, very rich. And we find that they become very frivolous and very careless with their money and in fact, very extravagant. And yet these same people would not lend a beggar $5, even though they would be very happy to dump loads of money on an extravagance. And so as this extends to our status in society, as much as we complain about the price of a product, when we talk about that product, that price becomes a bragging point, and the higher the price, the more the bragging rights. Well, good. So now you are able to brag. Congratulations. However, you pay for that. And it's okay if you can earn that. But if you can't, if you're struggling to make the ends meet, well, that becomes, quite a frivolous exercise. And so we see that there are inequalities. And one of those inequalities is the way energy flows. And we look at energy as kind of a water flow. And when you look at various farming techniques, they set up terraces. And so some water is at a higher altitude than others. And until you create a connection, there's no flow. But just because you make the connection, there's still no flow until you have an external pump to start the flow. So the connection becomes that transaction zone. And what's interesting about that is that you have to start it with an external pump. But once that flow begins, you can turn off that pump, pumping it through that connection, because the balance on the terracing will create a flow in that pipe, and it'll just continue to flow. What you do have to make sure of course, is that the upper terrace is constantly filling with water. So you don't need an external pump to start the flow, but you do need a pump to pump water in some fashion to maintain that reservoir to be able to continue the flow. So that terracing connection is really by gravity. And so we're kind of used to that because it's a falling gradient. And that falling gradient is not only the transaction zone, but is the connection between the upper and the lower. And so sometimes we look at that as either a superiority or an inferiority complex. And so, of course, one of the ways that we maintain that inferiority complex is to refer to us as the fallen angels, which is kind of a thing a trap, if you will, that we fall into, because that increases density, it increases pressure, it's increased gravity as we get closer to the core of the earth. And so we become more dependent on this earth space feeding. And then we have this internal pressure of the GANS. And this is what we're talking about, the GANS tech. It explodes like a popcorn. And the reason for that is because the angular momentum is conserved. So in other words, as we fall, something else is rising. And if we are all falling, something is just not adding up, is it? How can we all be falling? So let's refer, and a lot of people do this, they refer to the Bible. And I don't often do this because everybody likes to refer to the Bible and they do a good job, but everybody seems to come away with a different understanding of what they read. And so let's discuss one particular parable, the parable of the sower. Hear then ye the parable of the sower. When anyone heareth the word of the kingdom and understandeth it not, then cometh the evil one, and snatcheth away that which hath been sown in his heart. This is he that was sown by the wayside, and he that was sown upon the rocky places. This is he that heareth the word, and straightway with joy receiveth it. Yet hath he not root in himself, but endure it for a while. And when tribulation or persecution ariseth because of the word, straightway he stumbleth. And he that was sown among the thorns, this is he that heareth the word, and the care of the world, and the deceitfulness of riches, choke the word, and he becomes unfruitful. And he that was sown upon the good ground, this is he that heareth the word, and understandeth it, who verily beareth fruit, and bringeth forth some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. And so this is out of Matthew 13:18 to 13:23. And I've never heard about this myself because I'm not a student of this, I must admit, frankly. But it really contributes to the louche dilemma where we are louche harvesting, and each of us have this single-minded intention, and we see the effectiveness of it because, you know, those who rob, cheat, and steal have this benefit that most of us don't have. So as most of us look at this, we have the same hive mind intention. Yeah, I like your honey's better than my honey, so I'd like to take some. And so that becomes the supplanted GANS intention, and it becomes the intention of the fallen angel who has forgotten what he was sown with in terms of the true intention. And so if that intention had a seed and that seed was implanted in a wrong place, it's understandable that there would be a limitation, shall we say. But if it was placed in a right location, it would be fruitful. And so this message is what we're talking about today, because this is what we need to do, is translate what these words mean and translate what these thoughts are. And it becomes very important because in our generation, we have a different lingo than they did in previous generations. So, you know, what someone may call a chariot of a god, we would call a rocket ship. But, you know, it's the words of the era. And so as we carry on with this misunderstanding through generations, we lose our vitality. And so we're seeking vitality enhancement, and the Keshe Foundation has brought forward the Universal Body Enhancement Spaceships Unit to enhance the vitality, not just regular, but super, and not just emotion, but physical. And so one of the things we need to do is stop the leaking and start the healing. So that becomes a, shall we say, a method of operation. And it's hard to do when we don't understand the Ten Commandments and we don't understand who gave us the Ten Commandments and why they gave it to us and they didn't give it to my dog, but or my tulips. But we have other commandments, there we had missing commandments, another 14. And I seem to keep talking about this one, number 11, thou shalt not lie, because it puts a lot of pressure on me, because I couldn't tell how someone was lying. And when I learned that I shouldn't listen to the words, but listen to the intention, and then I discovered, well, yeah, I can tell when someone is lying. But it became very difficult because they were still giving me the lying words. And I had to listen to those lying words, knowing that they were lying. And the pressure is on me now to fake believing them. Because if I didn't, I would create a conflict point, which I didn't want. But I wanted to hear the truth. But all I was getting was the lies. And so my intention was in conflict with the liar. And it was up to me to cope with that. And so we find that there is some form of communication that transcends the words. And it's called the GANS truthfulness. So now we understand why poker, which is a game of liars, and the best liar is the winner. But there is no poker playing in outer space because, this becomes the truth seeker's dilemma. We have to have an accountability to self. So do we accuse someone of lying or do we just shield ourselves? But more importantly, the liar's dilemma has to have an accountability to the soul. And so do you quit lying to your soul or do you suffer the consequences? Because when we lie, we don't always suffer the consequences immediately. Those consequences can be delayed. Well, the GANS is interacting all the time. We learned the nanocoding process of the monatomic science with the cups of life, and we understood the truth. They were the cups of life, not the cups of the pandemic. And they represented our inner space and our emotional strength, and we manufactured physical cups and emotional cups. But also in the process, we created other GANSs, CO2, calcium, zinc, copper, water, and amino acid. And now we've demonstrated the production of gold in mass quantities. So we can produce many GANSs, but there's a different cup of life, and it's called the mind. And so that is tied into the one-track cup of the universe, where we bring together the effect of the copper GANS, which is physical, and the zinc GANS, which is emotional. But then we entertain this carbogen GANS, which is not of this earth. It is a connection to the universe. And so these connections remain and give us three fields of reference, but they manifest a physicality, which is a fourth field. And in that physicality, we can do many things. So it's actually more than four. So the thing is, we have still the connection, one, the copper, the zinc, and the carbon. And it's not three, it's more than three. We just didn't say how much more than three. And who's putting the limitations on how many. So an interesting thing that science has had to grapple with, and we talked about this before in the bicameral mind. Bicameral is bi is two and cameral is room. So the mind with two rooms or two hemispheres. And we find that language learning kills brain cells. And we find that calcium is brain food. The way I understand calcium is as a cartilage or as a bone or as a skull. It is also the seed of every cell in the body. But this seed comes from a source, and that source is in the brain. And so calcium is the nourishment and food of the brain. And that is scientifically documented. So this is nothing new. It just, if you're not talking about that subject, you might say, well, that is kind of new. And if you're not a knowledge seeker, you don't know what we're talking about when we talk about the transmutation highway, because we're so in tied down to the earth, the carbon-12 realm, which is the transmission highway, because it involves frequency, heat, and pressure. But there is a transition highway, the carbon-14 highway. And that highway allows us to connect between the transmission and the transmutation highway. And once we get to the transmutation highway, and why not? If we can go up one level, we can go up two levels, and why not? And are there any other levels beyond that? Well, we are still carbon and counting up to 16. So, how far do we go? I don't know. How big is large? So when we look at the bicameral mind and we say, okay, well, there's two hemispheres. Well, how does the copper GANS and the zinc GANS communicate when the copper is physical and the zinc is emotional? But forget that. Forget that. We also have the calcium GANS as brain food. Well, forget that. But how do we connect with the carbon-14 language translation, which is the language of the universe, the carbogen? Which language are we using? Which translator do we have to hire? If I'm into physicality and I'm using words, can I translate those words into emotion? Well, I went to a show last night. It was really, really good. Well, can you envision the emotions that I went through in this really, really good show? Or I went to a concert. The singer was fabulous. Wow, I can imagine in my mind fabulous. Can you? How fabulous was it? Well, and how do you measure it? So it's not conveying the true images. And so you just had to be there. That would have been the answer. But, if we're connecting with the universe, then the same argument applies, doesn't it? You just had to be there, in order to get the true translation. And so this is the dilemma that we're facing, because our society is very much confused. Even if we were all speaking English, we have confusion. But we need a translator to translate to all the different languages. So in all our broadcasts, we're broadcasting to all the continents. Well, all the continents speak different languages. There are English-speaking people in all the continents, but not all the people speak English. So this becomes a point of confusion. So how do we have these cup relationships? So it boils down to the magnetical gravitational relationship of each of the cups and the environment of the earth. And so don't forget the cup of the universe, the soul radiance. And so somehow the soul has to communicate with the emotion and the physicality and the earth and create that inertia field of our physical reality, which is the product of the bicameral mind manifesting into our physicality. And so we find that something is something. and nothing is nothing. Even when we look into space, we say, oh, well, there's nothing there. Really? Well, there's a lot of stuff there. It's just that it's not something that you understand, but it is something, and it is always something as opposed to being something else. And so wherever you are, that becomes your transaction zone. So if you're in the GANS, which we're talking about, the GANS tech, on the left-hand side, you see the cup from the top down, and you see a circular field start to be created within the GANS. And on the right side in the carafe there's actually a hole in the GANS. And there's no GANS in that hole. And so that transaction zone now becomes a hole and it gets filled with water. But why is there a hole in that GANS and the water fills it there? Why is there no hole in the water? And what about the air that's above that? And then, there's so many questions that come around, and, we just can't see it anymore because we have emerged from that physicality. And yet, when I give this to someone to hold it, they say, oh, I can really feel the energy. Oh, really? Can you explain to me in words what you feel? Oh, well, yeah, I feel kind of warm and peaceful. Well, that's pretty precise, isn't it? I'm sure you all, can interpret that. So what we're understanding is that when two forces to come together, they're coming together based on the susceptibility of the convergence, but it creates a singularity. And then you bring other fields together and they all work together in duality. But we didn't say which duality. So when we look at the star formation, it has four fields. And the duality is really the magnetical field, which we could say is in singularity, but the gravitational field, which is three fields of the star formation, well, that's not in duality, that's in a trinity. And then they all come together and they create this transaction zone, which now is a plasma energy that has no tangibility. So rotating balls filled with GANS create a field and then create a transaction zone with no tangibility. Imagine that. And if I were to tell you about that, would you be able to, in your mind's eye, see the picture? Wouldn't it be better if you made the cup of life yourself and seen that, where you can see the carbon nanocrystals, and you say, well, I had a copper wire and I nanocoated it, but the coating turned into carbon-6, and I had to have a field alignment. And then once I got that alignment, then I got a magnetical gravitational orientation. But the energy has to move, and it has to move in a direction. And so there was a flow. Without that direction, there would be no flow. It would just kind of be a lump. And so we find that energy is always in motion. And so it's looking for that Maggrav transfer state. And the reason for that is because that energy has to flow and has to move based on susceptibility. So we find that in the GANS state, that we can go from one side of the equation of the conservation of energy to the other side. But we can also go into different energy states. So we can drop down from the GANS state to the nanostate and then drop down to the atomic state. Or we can go from the atomic state up to the monatomic nanostate and then from there go into the GANS state, because it's a two-way street. And the reason it's a two-way street is because it has to obey the conservation of inertia. And this is true of everything, including communication. So what is different about the GANS from the nano is that the GANS has a high negative charge and therefore becomes magnetical. But this magnetical charge comes about because of the number of points on the surface. And to equalize those points, there's a positive charge at the gravitational core. And so to accommodate all of this, there has to be a GANS explosion. And so that explosion puts gaps, bigger gaps, and it's filled with gas. And that's why it's called GANS. Gas is a nanosolid. So now we have the GANS, and we have the pattern of energy flow in direction and in intensity. And so if we look at our bodies the way we're manifest, I wonder if the earth is the same way. Is the earth matter transacted in singularity or duality? So if we can take the GANs and manifest gold in mass quantities, then isn't that a replication of how the earth did it? The same kind of inertia density manifestation. So therefore, it wasn't just one GANS, was it? It must have been multiple GANSes. And once you have one transaction in singularity, you must have a complementary transaction in that duality. But as we said before, it could be in a GANS state, it could be in an atomic state, could be in a monatomic state, or it could be in a plasma state. Who's to say? It all depends on the susceptibility. But what we do know is that as miners, all we do is, in our self-serving energy binding ways, we steal it from Earth. So our claim to fame is that we can find the gold and we can excavate the gold, but that's kind of limited in your bragging rights because man up to now hasn't been able to produce the gold. So if we look at how the gold is produced, it's just a fragment of the complexity of the whole earth, because the whole earth is not gold. It is a collection of different elements on the periodic table of elements. And each one has a gravitational stability, and something is always something as opposed to being something else. So it has a dimensional portability. And so each of these dimension points, each one, and whatever it is, we don't specify. Well, we're just saying that in different energy states, pick one point and another point and another point, and the convergence of those 3 points gives you a basis for that nuclear feeding inertia, and then creates that inertia density manifestation. And then you get this periodic table of physical matter, which is represented by all the Earth space range details. And we see all these things that, we're looking to sustain life on this planet, beginning with the amino acid of the carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and hydrogen, and the emotion of the zinc and the physicality of the copper, the solution of the sodium chloride and the potassium and magnesium and calcium. And then the fundamental component of our emotional structure, the blood, is with iron, and the energy component being gold, which is why it's so precious. But not only, because every element on the periodic table of elements is precious. Just because you feel that one is more precious than another, you have to understand mag-grav as a counterweight. So you can capture that field in a singularity, but it has an angular momentum and an angular density, and we refer to it as the fallen angels. But I prefer to refer to us as the arrived angels. It's just how we cross the flux lines of gravity. Are we dropping or are we landing? And who's doing the talking, isn't it? Because each one has a point of view. And if we understand this GANS counterweight, we can see that as we move through these flux lines, imagine these flux lines in a cup of GANS. That cup of GANS has water in it. And so each level in that water, although it doesn't have white lines like on a paved road, there are flux lines. And we see some GANS floating up and some GANS floating down, and there doesn't seem to be a current. So there is motion, and it goes through each of these gradients by gradient transition. And so to maintain that energy state, and as we know that to maintain your MAGRAPH state, you have to give and take. And so in the process of giving and taking, you can either increase or decrease your density. And so in order to move up, you have to drop one and pick up another. But interestingly, to go down, you have to drop one and pick up another. So the question is, are you picking up something that is less dense, or are you picking up something that is more dense? And that defines your motion. And then how fast you go is the steepness, the transition gradient itself. So we find that this energy in motion is always counterbalanced because we created this GANS from, shall we say, thin air, but more appropriately, because of the amino acid that also was produced, we should say, well, it came from the fat air. And we find that this energy in motion is represented by hydrogen as an energy pack. But hydrogen is not just hydrogen. It too has a diatomic structure, and it has a covalent bond there. But there are two possibilities. In the orthohydrogen, the poles are alike. In the parahydrogen, the poles are opposite. But since they're balanced on both sides, there is no change in the conformity. But there is the same covalent bond, but there's a different countermeasure. So in other words, the energy exchange is different. And so we have this difference, which represents the difference in the energy transaction coming from the source or the field connection through carbon-14 or through the universe, which is carbon-60. And, we have many more unanswered questions, but now we're coming confronted to the point where we can't say, I don't know anymore. But what we are going to have to say is, we don't have the answers at this point in time. But the problem or the question is there. And now we have to be confronted with the question, how does this happen? Where did it come from? Where did we come from? Where are we going? And, what's it all about, Alfie? So we have this dynamic plasma. It's a field capture in singularity, but this inertia field capture actually has two singularities. And it's the interaction of these fields. And it gives you not only the containment within the plasma field, but it also creates these flux lines. And then it also creates these magnetical fields that go around the plasma. And we have to remember that the interaction with another field is what's causing the manifestation of this plasma. So we have a dynamic plasma actually created. And you could say, well, it's in one field or it's in the other field, or it's a combination of the two fields. So, but we have to make sure that in our words, we have the right reference and the right context. But remember that what we're seeing in that manifestation is a product of these substructures in the background. So it's like when we look at the Earth and how it relates to others, we look at them as interacting spheres, where the North Pole is connected to the South Pole and the South Pole is connected to the North Pole. So right away, a transfer state that is moving in two directions. And so we see that the poles can flip and the energy can flip right along with it. And if the north is the giving and the south is the taking, well, now we understand how things are crossing over. And that's the difference between the bicameral mind and the physicality. And so this becomes a transaction zone where we are trying to balance this mass point of view, where the mass of one is part of the equation and it involves the mass of the other. We just didn't say which other. We don't know. But we have to take it into account. And so in most cases, we take the simplest route. We just take what we can see and we ignore the rest. Well, we're missing this radiance pole flipping because there's a polyatomic gradient transitioning that goes from this feeding radiance to this feedback radiance, understanding that our plasma is gravitational in the core. And we have this vertical emission. And so this emission goes all around, and it's a magnetical plasma. And of course, it's magnetical, but it moves. And so it's moving to another point. It's still a magnetical plasma, but at that point, it becomes gravitational. And so now we come in going through this transaction zone with this confounding notion that the magnetical plasma is magnetical in its departure and gravitational in its arrival, but it's still magnetical plasma. Well, when does this thing change and what is representing the change? Well, the motion itself is the transaction zone. And once you've achieved that, then it continues to move. And in order to do that, that magnetical plasma will have to be magnetical again. And so it continues from pole to pole, and that's how it moves, but also from plasma to plasma. And where is this excess energy coming from? Is it always coming from the core, or is it a cosmic ray feeding that is also coming in? Well, if it's coming into the magnetical plasma that is surrounding the plasma core, then there must be a gravitational feeding as well to balance it off. And that is a simple context in the plasma reality. But we're living in a physical reality. And so we have to understand that the exchange of energy is done exactly the same way. And if it's done that way here, then it's done that way everywhere, because these are the universal laws of this emission, that within our core, we have a transaction zone. Within the motion in the magnetical field, we have a transaction zone. And that transaction zone is being fed by another plasma field. And so that too becomes a transaction zone. So now we're looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 transaction zones. And all we were talking about was the feeding radiance and the feedback radiance coming together. Well, this is getting very complicated. But listen, it's very stable, isn't it? Because look at our existence. It's all based on the energy exchange. So the energy is always positive. So it's not the charge. The charge is negative or positive based on its direction. And that direction and the intensity is based on the polar energy of the magnetical emission. And what affects is the rotation of the field and the speed of it, the strength of it, and the direction of it. And then it converges with the absorption of the gravitational field. So the interaction of the magnetical and gravitational fields in all positions is what's going on. So now we're looking at many multitude of transactions. And we can't stop and look at each individual one. We just look at the whole thing. One is a discharge and one is a recharge. Let's just keep it simple. Look at the gravitational falling, what we call the binding zone, the binding points. And we just have an arbitrary point of view that has come together somewhere, and then we have all of these loose ends. And we say, well, are these they just end, or are they connected to something? Well, we can't see what they're connected to, so we just kind of say, well, we ignore it. But so when we look at the star formation, now we understand that to maintain that star formation, there has to be a gravitational magnetical relationship. So that involves 2 points of view. But the net point of view is a magnetical gradient charge. And so it comes together with another manifestation point of view, magnetical gravitational, with a net gravitational gradient charge. And both of them are susceptible to increase or decrease. And so the coming together of the transaction zone, which is the gravitational inertia point, is also subject to change. And so things are turning and churning all the time, and it's perfectly normal. So look at you sitting in the chair. You're not getting dizzy, are you? You're very stable. And so this concept of the duality, we have to understand that it involves 2 points that work together in tandem. It's a partnership. So we call it the twinity, where you have one field and interacting with another field. And so there's a transaction zone there. But then when you look at the plasma fields, they can involve different aspects of matter, or they can involve different aspects of the plasma. But they are duality, and that duality can interact with another duality. So that too becomes the transaction zone. So this point of 2 points, or this point of twinity, is what we have to understand is the source of the product of what we have. That becomes the inertial density manifestation point. So even when we look at natural creation, we have to understand that it follows the same pattern, that this motion is ray motion and is creation. It's natural creation and is balanced off by natural decay. So when we look at the decay aspect of it, this is in the background, and it too is balanced. And so between the two is a boundary and a bonding area. And just because we don't understand it, we kind of round it off to the nearest dollar. We don't count the nickels and dimes. So this concept of the twinity applies to the nanotech and the picotech and the star tech. And so we call it the twinity of the nanotech and the twinity of the GANS tech. And so when we go to the store at the Keshe Foundation, we see many references to the twinity, and that's what it is. So when you have this twinity, it implies a transaction zone automatically. And this is where, shall we say, the benefit comes. So the physical translation of all of this energy exchange is all manifest through these polyatomic inertia gradients. And some are converging in a gravitational manner, and some are converging in a magnetical manner, because in order to create this overall field, you have to have energy flowing in 2 directions. So each field is magnetical gravitational, each interaction is magnetical gravitational, and each layer is magnetical gravitational, and each and every one of these is a transaction zone. So altogether, it looks very complex, but in reality, it's very, very simple, because the maggrav acts as a counterweight. It has 2 points of view, and they seem to be opposite. Well, they're not opposite per se as a conflict. but they could be opposite as a binding zone, or they could be opposite as a transaction zone. So that transaction zone becomes that gravitational inertia point. Does it retain its manifestation, or does it depart? Does it actually leave, as we saw on the cover of book number 3? So we understand this physical affinity because we are physical, but we are just bags of GANS. And so when you look at a GANS ball, its physical affinity is the emotional charge. So how do we translate our physical words to emotional words? Because if you're in Georgia and you're a Georgia peach, and how much does your husband love you? Well, my husband loves me Cadillac. Oh, is that a fact? Well, my husband loves me Mercedes. So now it becomes a competition. But when we look at the emotional affinity, now we see something else. We see the two hemispheres, and we have to go through this language translation where we have the physical copper and the emotional zinc. So we have to translate that, and we have the calcium food and the carbogen connection and some other source, and then we have the soul as the interpreter. So we have all these different languages, and we have to translate them. Well, which language are we using? Because the languages that we know, such as English, French, or German, or whatever, is not the language of the soul, is it? So we have these word limitations, and we talked about that. You know, we have to keep it in context. We have to have a reference, an environment, a belief, an experience. But they're interchange errors. We find that references in the Bible to the lords, it's plural. And they talk about lords on horseback. So these words actually become a barrier. And they call it Babylon, where we've suddenly introduced many different languages. Why should everybody speak the same language? That would be too easy. Why do we have all these different languages? So we need translation. Why? Because we have errors. We confuse gods with lords. Well, how many gods are there? And do they ride on horseback? So we have these counterweight measures we have to take into account, where we look at the most important state for us is the physical state, and we measure things by weight. That's gravitational. But in the atomic state, we measure it by mass, and it too is gravitational. But when we get into the next state, which is the nuclear state, we measure it by Teslas, which is the measurement of the magnetical field forces. Well, in plasma, we measure it by time, and that too is magnetical. So we can counterweight within each state or in between states, and we have all the possibilities because of this dynamic plasma relationship. The horizontal transmission and the vertical transition and the transaction zone of that Earth space point within and the Earth space field with the rotating fields and the flux lines all around. And so when we look at the creation of the plasma and how it affects life, that transaction zone is the bringing together of the carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen. It's fundamental to the creation of life. These are the building blocks of life, but they create a structure within a structure. So these structures have to all complement each other, and they have a magnetical gravitational relationship. So that becomes whatever is manifest as a result of that becomes a transaction zone. So we talk about the carbon inertia highway, the carbon 12, carbon 14, and the carbon 16, and understand that they operate in duality, but that doesn't say that they're not operating in duality with something in the background. And if that thing in the background also has inertia fields, who's to say it's not operating with something in its background? We just can't differentiate these things because we don't have a reference, but we can acknowledge that it does exist. And so we found in the 603rd Knowledge Seekers Workshop, sure, we have a vertical alignment and we have path links and we have the infinity loop, but there's a different path as well. And each path leads to inertia threshold crossing. So each manifestation being an inertia point, did we say which manifestation energy state? So when we're talking about the GANS tech, what's important to understand is how it compares to water, because GANS flows in water. And so we can see that the water can exchange energy, and we know that water can give and take energy, and so does the GANS. So the GANS exchanges magnetical energy, and likewise it exchanges gravitational energy. And now we know why. It has the conservation of energy rules that it follows and sets up MAGRAP pathways. We know that the gravitational intensity is the attraction feedback, but the magnetical outintensity is the repulsion feeding. And so atomically, we look at the electron and we say, okay, well, the electron is very, very tiny and the neutron is very, very large. And, we've been given that and we see the difference. But do we really see the difference? Because we now have the Midas touch. We look at the Peace Dome reactor where it creates a dimension point we call shielding, and another dimension point we call star positioning, and then another dimension point we call the possession. And this is what we want, don't we? We all like the gold, don't we? And so our unity within the community is reflective of our inner space unity, what we give our time and attention to. So the translation at that binding zone is to translate the mental language with the physical language, because there's a bonding, and the soul language and the consciousness language. There too is a bonding, and the energy and intention language, and there is a bonding. And so these are all different languages, and the only one that speaks English or any language in the land of Babylon is the physical. None of the other categories talk physically. So we have an undifferentiated beginning, and the only way that we can understand things is with words and with vision and physicality. So the neutron created the atom, and the atom did not balance with the neutron. Something was missing. And so that's this energy that's in motion, and it's in motion all over the place. But which one do you pick? So either way, the one that arrives at that transaction zone came from the darkness within, and it manifests in its physicality, and that's where we had the light without. But in the darkness, it still had to be manifest. So we just can't see what was going on there. And so we ignore that. And those things we have difficulty with. We have difficulty discussing about gods and lords and all sorts of other things because we don't have the right translation of the understanding. So the fundamental principle matter is this energy that's out there in the vacuum of space. We can't see it. It looks empty, but it's full of PM ticks because nothing is nothing. You've got all these energy packs coming, and when they come together and converge as antimatter, dark matter, and matter gen, all of these factors create this plasma gen conversion. And until it comes together with the Earth space and has that field interaction, which we call inertia, in that manifestation, then we have our own magrav bodies gravitationally created on this planet. And we call that life. And it's our physicality, our body, our coming together from the source, which we have to remember is the convergence of these plasmas. And one plasma would be magnetical and one plasma would be gravitational because there's no two plasmas of the same. So they come together in this transaction zone and they create this field. And then that field has to be manifest, and it can manifest gravitationally. And we know that because we have oxygen as a non-visible gas, and yet it is totally gravitational. And the only way that we can see it is because it leaves a visible fingerprint in the emission spectrum. And so that represents the emission light of the oxygen, and it's crossing that threshold coming from the plasma state into the physical state of matter. Or we could say, more accurately, from the plasma state to the plasma state of matter. Not the same thing. So the matter plasma we see as physical because we can touch it and see it, but the matter gen plasma is the plasmatic plasma is magnetical because we can't touch it or see it. But this is all part of the matter plasma dimension, and we are feedback dominant. That in terms of the plasma science, the matter plasma is part of the gravitational understanding of the one side of the conservation of energy. We now have to acknowledge the other side. It is becoming imperative with respect to our existence. So this plasma matter dilemma isn't just in understanding the GANS state, but the next neighbor being the plasma state also crosses this magrav energy transfer state. But it is part of the substructure of our physicality. As we go into higher energy states, we become less dependent on that physicality. So we have to drop one and pick another up. But do we have to drop off all of our physicality? Or is that our bounty? Is that the product of our existence? Is that the profit? Is that the reward? So is this molecular matter, the coming together, representative of that communication link, the covalent bond between two masses? And so you have one mass with a magnetical gravitational relationship and another mass with a gravitational magnetical relationship and the transaction zone in between, which we call the bonding zone. And the same is true with the atomic matter, because we have the neutron manifesting into the atomic energy plus the PM tick. And it's a two-way street. And we know that we can do that because we all did it. We all crossed the threshold of matter, where we took the singularity of each field and created the duality of the magrav of the inertia field, and then converted it into a physical field. So the arrival of that physical field had to cross the transaction zone. And how did we do that? Did we do it with language, or was language a barrier? So when we look at the dimension star formation, we had to translate the dimension points of view. There's a soul point of view. There's a soul physicality point of view. This is setting up the threshold of awareness. Then we have the physical interpretation. That's the collective point of awareness. So how do we translate all of these when the only point of view that can interpret anything in English or with words or with language is the physical one? Everything else is talking about a completely different language. And yet we can manage to communicate somehow. But now we're going to have to communicate with the rest of the universe, because the rest of the universe knows by connection. You can't yell at them because they can't hear you, because they don't recognize frequency. You can't fight with them because they won't fight with you. And you can't lie to them because they see your true intention. So we have to find out how the universe is having this contiguous connection. And in order to participate, we have to understand that this contiguous connection is done through the translation to truthfulness. There's no lying in outer space. And the worst thing is when you lie to yourself. So, we talk about this artificial intelligence. Well, that's, there is a generational point of view, and the artificial intelligence increases the speed of the generational learning. And then there's this overwhelming history that we have. So the artificial intelligence increases the speed of learning the historical context. But what about the transgenerational awareness, the teachings of the Creator? What artificial language are we using now? So we're dependent on this supplementation due to consumption. And our consumption is an acquired knowledge, which is a conditional teaching by ancient teachers. But the Creator gave us unconditional teaching. And so now we have a new awareness. So we see there's a historical threshold between the cosmic feeding and the loosh harvesting. And we need to cross that threshold, because if we don't, then we don't understand humanity's cross as a burden, where we have the physical connection between the soul and the physicality, and the plasmatic connection between the soul of physicality and either the soul or the physicality. So it's humanity's cross as a burden, or it's humanity crossing that threshold through awareness and heading into uncharted territory where we are the herd at the turning point. There are many stars all beyond the monatomic state of the nano, and they're all covering the full range from decay to radiation. So the AI is actually ancestral intelligence, and we are the technology. We are that inertia product, and we are the image of our dimensional convergence point. And so we get to choose. And in order to do that, we have to also choose how we shield ourselves. We have to have this inertia of humanity shielding from hostiles, from aggression, from environmental harm, from fear mongering, and from emotional abuse. And can we do that? What is our skill set? So we find that the limiting factor on this planet is time. So we use time as a counterweight. We see transmission as a frequency. We see transition as an amplitude, and transmutation as a containment. But we have a physicality at the fulcrum, and we have the soul of physicality on one side and the soul on the other side. So we use as a time as a measure, but time as an earth space reference, because outer space is zero time as a travel reference. So time on this planet is measured versus zero time as a counterweight. The two operate as duality, and we didn't understand what time really meant. But now we're coming to that confrontation. We're crossing that memory threshold, that tipping point. Sure, we have this long-term memory, but freedom connects us to the real memory because there's different memories. There's a lifelong memory, there's a historical memory, and an ancestral memory. But overall, there's a universal memory, and they all speak a different language. So how do we interpret this? How do we understand this? Well, the fact of the matter is that energy states go through a transition, which allows for elevation, which we call physical matter state to energy state, or inertia, which allows energy state to physical matter state. And so when we talk about elevation, that involves expansion, like the GANS explosion. So we see that energy is portable. It can go from state to state. And so can our understanding, because we are all part of the dynamic soul initiators. Well, who are they? Well, there's the soul of the creator. There's the soul of the earth. There's the soul of the family of humanity. There's the soul of man. There's the soul of the body. There's even a soul of the cells. And no translation is needed. You don't have to say a word. You don't even have to explain it. But we try because we are accustomed to ignoring the soul food that is coming our way. So we have to tune in to the cosmic rays, plug into the creator, if you will. So we have to turn on that energy and drop out of our resistance so that we can receive this collective energy that is coming together at that inertia point. And so you get to provide the pattern, and you get the energy, or you get more or less. I guess it all depends on how much what you want and what you give your time and attention to. So for 614 Knowledge Seekers workshops in a row, spanning over 11 years, we've been suddenly confronted with the science of plasma science transcending the limitations of nuclear science. And in that process, we're seeking that greater oneness. What oneness is that? And so there are many ways to interpret that. And since we have many languages, we need many translators. Well, we're in the process of turning diamonds into gold in mass quantities because we're in the May 10th of 2025 crossing of the threshold that allows us to seek out the GANS affinity of truth. And so we're seeking research teams to continue this because really we're in the early stages of it. But now we are going to grow up very, very quickly to the reality. And don't we see that around the world where through wars, the parents die and the young children have to grow up very fast. They don't get to play in the sand at the age of 10 or 11. They have to learn how to carry a gun. Young men. So we need a rescue. We need a technology rescue because our beds are burning. And that involves a scientific, financial, political rescue. Manifests as a preservation rescue, doesn't it? And so we have to understand consumption. We have to understand creation. These are all part of the rescue process. And so we've been practicing. And in October, we just finished the transmutation tests for that month. And we'll see what the new horizon is coming because things are changing as we speak. So when we look at the translation of intention, what determines a successful nation? Well, it has to have a determination and an honesty, which depends on action. It depends on truthful action. And of course, it depends on dependability. And it depends on the integrity of the GANS translator. And if the GANS translator can't lie, then it depends on the interpretation of the GANS, of the cup of emotion with the cup of physicality, which are in two different languages, and words don't matter. That's the problem. So sometimes the seeds fall on the good ground, and sometimes seeds fall on the other ground. And so we can move these seeds to the better ground using the One Nation Network, opening up the blinds of One Nation Network at a time. And that time is now. So here we are. Our mission is to bring peace on earth and join humanity with the universal community. We want to bring man as equal to all the beings in the universe by teaching the plasma science and technology equally to everyone, that no one is left out and no one is abused due to the lack of knowledge. And we do this through the Peace Treaty. This is the Keshe Foundation Spaceship Institute teachings on plasma science. So we're welcoming all the beautiful knowledge seekers of the carbon nations, learning about the new selection process of the new organic plasma science. There's a World Peace Treaty. Choose it, sign it unconditionally, and mean it sincerely. See, the point of the true GANS tech is to cross these polyatomic boundaries. The wars on Earth space do not translate across the peace dome. Is the inertia of the present governed by the dimensions of history? Well, it's time to learn the history of self in a universal context, because the GANS is a peaceful superconductor of true intentions. The GANS tech needs translators for each of the matter state, plasma state, and universal state. So we need to continue to deliver the plasma science daily via the Peace Dome in a practical exchange for peace on Earth. So welcome to the new golden outer space age. Humanity and all. I hope you enjoyed this trip. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Let's see if any of the participants, you've aroused any sort of questions or perplexities within them that they'd like to ask a question of you or state something that they understand. Again, it does look like some new teachers are sort of coming in. He said they have a lot to teach the man. So perhaps we'll have the teachings done in a different way. I'm not sure how this is going to happen. Are they going to use their voices or will it be a plasmatic transfer? But he said they had a lot to teach the man. So there's got to be an interaction coming at some point. And how that knowledge is going to be transferred is, again, I'm just wondering. I was thinking the One Nation Network may have a role to play in that, as we could sort of use that to transfer matter state knowledge to the visitors, and the visitors could use that to transfer other knowledges that they may possess, in addition to them teaching, I guess. I know he referred to teaching. So what is this teaching that they're going to do? Does that mean you'll be obsolete, Alex, or I'll be obsolete as they take over the teachings, or something else is happening here?
Well, we won't be obsolete. We may be reassigned, but the thing is, the teaching is a two-way street. And if we understand that, then, we can't just look at it as, they're going to come here and they're going to teach everything, to us. It's just like, in this context here today, I'm playing the role of teachers, but don't assume that I know everything, because as I tell you, in my point of view, I don't know very much. So whatever I know is minuscule compared to what the knowledge that is out there. So it just behooves all of you to gain the knowledge from other sources. And each of us has access to the creator. Each of us has that connection. And we don't have a language barrier for that. It's universal. That's what it means to be part of the universal community. And that connection is unconditional. Why is it unconditional? Because it's peaceful. So that means warmongers who impose conditionality are basically, you know, tearing up their tickets to the universal state. And that's not my problem, that's their problem. My problem is to fulfill my purpose. And it's wonderful to be here, able to talk to you and to give my point of view. So I'm hoping and trusting that it's beneficial to you. And so all of us together take that knowledge and understanding and be able to do more and be more collectively, regardless of the blockages that we have with the limitations of words and the new understanding of the conveyance of emotion and the interaction of emotion with the translation process. Back to you, Mark.
Okay, thank you. Let's see if any of the participants have a question they'd like to ask. I just can't understand how we're going to fall when we don't even know these beings in a way. I mean, most of humanity, he says, this is a pitfall that we're going to be up against, that they'll, I guess, treat them as just because they know a bit more. How are we going to fall for this? I don't know. But let's see if anyone else has any. I mean, the knowledge seekers are being positioned that we certainly won't be fooled, but are they going to be promoted as some sort of gods or something from space or declare themselves? It just doesn't seem to mesh with the ethos that we've been taught.
But it does mesh with our historical interpretation. We studied mythology, we studied the Greek gods, and we studied the gods with their chariots and their chariots of fire. So we've been there and done that. But clearly, from our point of view, we have advanced as a civilization, and so things have changed. Now, what does that mean exactly in terms of change? We say, well, we've progressed from being cavemen, and we now live in condominiums, which are really high-rise caves. So has anything really changed? We've been fighting for thousands of years. Has anything changed there? Well, we are coming to the realization that we haven't taken enough into account, and we're going to be coming face to face with that reality. And, you know, it's just happening. It's like, it's like a special, you be put on notice. You live this comfy life in false understanding, and now there's a new understanding coming, and you have to cope with it. And do we have words in the English language to convey that message, or are we going to have to learn an entirely new language? Well, what is easiest to understand is the universal language. We don't need a translator for that.
Okay, very good. Anyone else want to bring up an issue or a question or state something? All right, not hearing anything.
Mark, let me thank the audience here for allowing me to continue to present. And, I'm really grateful to the input for a lot of the knowledge seekers here in every way. Your contributions are immense, far more than, we give ourselves credit for it, because collectively we are contributing to the new understanding of the universal teaching. So thank you all for being here, and thank you for all your support. And let's bring peace and prosperity to this planet. I think it's overdue. Back to you, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Let me just bring up the three wise men. And of course, the other oil that sort of goes with it. And of course, this is where you can sort of start tuning your own reactors. And only I think you have that sort of control over it, about this thinking, speaking, and acting good. Easier said than done, but I think this creates that shielding. And I always thought that even before. And then when I heard Mr. Kesh say that this 3I is creating a repulsive atmosphere around it, that nothing can sort of, any of the negative things can actually penetrate within the structure. So this is, in a way for us to create a shielding or an atmosphere around us that allows that same sort of replication of a protective shield, in a way. Not that you'll be 100% completely protected, but it's certainly a way to approach it and tune our reactors into a more elevated position. Again, by giving rather than trying to take away from others through our thoughts or our words or our actions. And then, of course, if you can apply that, you will feel proud about the work you do, and you'll feel proud about the person you are, and you'll feel proud about the difference we're all making, I think. But again, it's for you to apply this. And I think through the technology, this will become easier and easier. And of course, the feeding will move us away from the killing and destructive nature gradually and slowly and collectively.